Okay, this is a video to go over the sample FRQ from Unit 4 that reflects the ample reserves market. So this is the question. It says, assume that the economy of Eichland is operating below full employment. Draw a correctly labeled graph of long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand, and show each of the following. Then we have to show the current equilibrium labeled as Y1 and PL1 and full employment as YF. So what I'm going to do is I've kind of gotten this question ready to make the video a little bit quicker, but take a look at your graph and just be cognizant or aware of your labels, because newer questions from the College Board like this are starting to shift to Y1 and PL1 as opposed to YE and PLE. So just pay careful attention to your labels. And I'm going to scroll down here and I've gotten this ready. And what we're going to do is we've drawn our short-run aggregate supply, our aggregate demand, price level, and real GDP. And remember, they're operating below full employment. So we're going to draw that long-run aggregate supply over here to reflect a recessionary gap. We're going to label that YF. And then we are going to label the short-run equilibrium as Y1 and PL1. And remember that you earn 2 points for every graph. You earn 1 point for drawing the short-run equilibrium as Y1 and PL1 in the correct location, plus all your other labels. And then you're going to earn a second point for having the long-run aggregate supply in the correct location. So let's head back to the question. The question now says, assume that the banking system of Eichland has ample reserves and that the central bank targets a new policy rate to reach full employment. Makes sense. That's what central banks do. Should the central bank increase or decrease administered interest rates? So first of all, this is exercising monetary policy with an ample reserve system. And remember that open market operations and an ample reserve system do not change the interest rate anymore. So all the Fed has to do in this scenario, or the central bank, I should say, is just decrease the interest rates. And the reason why is because this is going to make borrowing more affordable. It's going to incentivize borrowing. People will then borrow that money and spend it to either consume and make those big financial moves, or they will use it to invest in their companies and in their businesses. And then you'll notice in part C, we have to graph that. So I'm going to hop down here and do both of those tasks at once. The central bank should decrease administered interest rates. And again, that is going to incentivize borrowing. Now we have to graph it. So when I'm filming this video, it's 2024, and the ample reserves are a relatively new part of our curriculum. And this is a graph that you've probably only drawn a handful of times. So I just want to draw your attention to a few features. Number one, make sure that you draw the changes in the graph over here on the left as a hard angle. And what I mean by that is try not to draw them as a swoop, because doing the change in the interest rate will be that much more difficult. So I'm going to use a different color to draw the change, so that way you can see the difference. So we want to lower the interest rate. So I'm going to do a down arrow here. I'm going to draw a straight line over to exactly where we were. And then I'm going to trace that same downward sloping curve we had about an equal distance below it, and then drag it horizontal across. We're going to show that demand for reserves going downward. And then we're going to draw that new policy rate with the down arrow. And we're just going to call this policy rate, you know what? I'm going to call that number 1. And this one should just be the plain old policy rate. So again, you're going to get 2 points for this graph. So 1 for just drawing it correctly and having all your labels, and then another point for lowering the interest rate. And what you want to be careful of is that you do not want to take this new graph further over here, right? You just want to trace that existing downward sloping curve. So all we're doing with demand is we're either shifting it upwards or downwards. And if you draw that hard angle, it should be much easier to reflect what the College Board is looking for you to do. Going back to the question, we then see something that's pretty typical of these longer questions, which is assessing multiple concepts in one question. So rather than just entertaining monetary policy, let's look at D. And it says the policymakers pursue a fiscal policy rather than. So we're kind of going back to where we were in the first part of the question. You got this recessionary gap. Assume that the MPC is 0.8 and the value of the recessionary gap is 300 million. So important information. Recall that the spending multiplier is 1 over the MPS. So all I did was subtract 0.8 from 1 to get 0.2. And to turn this into a spending multiplier, you certainly could use your calculator, or you could just remember that 1 over 0.2 is the same as 1 over 2/10. Multiply by the reciprocal to get rid of that fraction. And we're going to come out with 5 as the spending multiplier. And then what they're asking us to do here is to entertain if the government is going to spend that money in part 1, or in number 2, let's suppose they didn't spend the money. Let's just have them lower taxes. And we're being asked, would the change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the minimum change in spending that you figured out in D? So this is a common question. Sometimes they ask us if they did do an equal amount of taxes, would the GDP change be smaller than, greater than, or equal to? So this is, would the tax change? So let's swing down here and do both of those together. You'll notice that I've gotten this ready with the math for the spending multiplier right here. In this question, they're challenging us a bit because they're giving us the change in GDP. So don't fall into autopilot and think of multiplying 300 times 5. We have the 300, we know the spending multiplier, and now we have to solve for the spending. So hopefully without a calculator, you can get here pretty easily. But again, you can use that for function. The 300 divided by 5, okay, so I'm going to divide both of these by 5, is going to give us a change in spending of 60 billion, right? Okay, now the spending multiplier is 5, so therefore the tax multiplier is -4, because remember, they add up to 1. So what you could do is you could divide the 300 billion for part 2, and you could figure out that 300 divided by a -4 is going to come out with a tax cut of 75 billion to bring $300 billion worth of change. But it's not good enough just to put those numbers down. We have to put it into a sentence. We see the word explain. The minimum change in taxes required would be greater than. Oops, I had the word than in there already. So greater than the minimum required change in spending, because households and businesses will save a portion of their income. So this is suitable for an answer, but if you wanted to put in the minimum change in taxes would be greater than or 75 billion, because households will save a portion of their income, you need to have this because reason in here to get those points awarded to you. Okay, so that's really important to the answer of the question. And in this part of the question, you will earn 1 point, and it's an all or nothing thing. So if you said that would be greater than and put the number down, but you didn't explain why, you are not going to get credit for that. So that's really important. Okay? All right, the next thing is part E. And part E is a tricky part of the question. And I hate to tell you this, but this is a great example of an FRQ where you could have 3 possible correct answers. And it really depends on how you explain your logic. And that's why knowing the reasons why is super duper important. Okay. So now we're going to go back to assume the government lowers income tax to eliminate the recessionary gap. Okay, so the key word here is eliminate. So in order to eliminate the gap, we figured out earlier that they would have to spend cut $75 billion worth of taxes, okay? So what will happen to each of the following? Will they increase, decrease, or stay the same? So you have a 33% chance of guessing there if you didn't know for sure. However, we also have these explains listed there. So there's actually 2 points up for grabs. There's one here and one here. So your explanations are key or else you will not get the point. So first of all, I hope right away you know if we cut taxes, aggregate demand is going to increase. And what we should put there is because there will be more disposable income for households and businesses, and therefore they're going to spend money. But I also want you to put something about the fact that businesses might in fact use their newfound income not just to consume and buy more things, but they might invest it in technology, okay? So there's a couple of ways that the short run aggregate supply in the long run might react, therefore impacting the long run aggregate supply. So we don't have to graph any of this, but I want to show you some of it up on my graph above. Again, you don't have to graph any of it. So aggregate demand as a result of this shift would shift to the right, and it would eliminate the recessionary gap, right? So that's what the question is telling us, that it would change that. I get that right on the line. Okay, so now the thing is that would eliminate the recessionary gap, and the question is then what? So one option for the long run aggregate supply is that it would simply just stay where it is. And the only reason why it would stay where it is because the only thing that would change is businesses and households would consume more. And then in the long run, there would be no short run aggregate supply shift that takes the long run with it because there is no change to the inputs. It's just more consumption. So that's one acceptable answer, that the long run aggregate supply will stay the same because there's no change in productivity or resource prices. The next option is imagine how these lower taxes are going to influence other things in the economy. And again, you can't see everything on this one graph, but remember, we have this graph called the supply of loanable funds and the demand of loanable funds. Okay, when you put money into a bank and you earn interest on it, the government considers that income. So if they lower taxes on income, then this is sort of an incentive to put money away in a bank and save it and earn some of that interest. So that would lower real interest rates. And if that happened, then you might see that short run aggregate supply shifting to the right, and then that long run would come with it and shift to the right as well. This also gets into the concept of supply side economics. So another thing that you could say is that lowering taxes, yes, will increase aggregate demand, but they also could shift the short run aggregate supply to the right as well. And that, of course, both of those things happening at the same time would bring the long run aggregate supply with them as well. The other thing that's interesting is that lowering taxes could lead to a deficit. And if we had a deficit in this economy, the supply of loanable funds or would shift to the left because there would be less money, or the demand for loanable funds would shift to the right, causing real interest rates to increase. So instead of businesses being able to invest more, they might actually be investing less. Short and aggregate supply could shift to the left because there'd be less investment, and that would bring the long run to the left. Because of the concept of crowding out, right? So when real interest rates discourage private investment, that answer for me is kind of the last one that I would ever think about as a student of this. The first thing that I would think about is this concept of the long run just staying where it was because there would be no change, right? There would be no change in the inputs because we just have more consumption. So that would be my first answer. That's my natural inclination. And guess what? It's great because it gets a point. And then the other three answers that I gave you are incidentally possible responses. So first of all, number one, this question is great. It brings together the new stuff from ample reserves, and it also brings in this concept of like, you might have multiple correct answers.